In a snowy mountain town, a lonely black man lives quietly in a small cabin. That afternoon he sees two tiny footprints leading to a frozen lake, but no footprints return. He rushes outside, finds two young girls trapped under the ice, and dives in to save them. He brings them home, warms them, and feeds them. What he doesn't know is that they are the missing daughters of a billionaire, and his brave act is about to change his life forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The wind howled against the pine trees like a hungry thing, tearing through the quiet little town of Everpine, Montana, with a fury that had been building for days. Snow fell in relentless sheets, swirling like whispers too urgent to ignore, blanketing the landscape in a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, watchful, holding its breath. In a small wooden cabin on the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the last plowed road, Amos Carter stirred a kettle of soup over a crackling fire. His hands, thick with calluses and memory, moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of doing things alone. The radio on the shelf crackled to life, its signal fading in and out with the storm. Whiteout conditions expected through the night. All emergency services on delay. Stay inside, stay safe. He turned it off with a quiet click. The storm didn't scare him. Nothing really did anymore. Amos Carter, once a firefighter in the city, once a husband and father, now just a man with too many winters behind him and too few reasons to hope. 3 years ago, a sudden avalanche outside town had buried a highway curve and taken with it the only family he had. His wife, Selena, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sasha, had been on their way home from the winter market when the snow came down. Rescue had been too slow, regret too quick. He'd left the city after that, bought a piece of land with what was left of the life insurance payout, built this cabin himself, brick by brick, nail by nail, mostly to keep his hands busy enough to forget how empty they felt. Now, in the deep of winter, the world outside was frozen quiet. He lived alone, spoke little, and asked for nothing. Just the stove, the radio, and a framed picture of two smiling girls. He couldn't bring himself to move from the windowsill. He was ladling soup into a chipped bowl when he noticed it. Something just past the fogged window, a disturbance in the white. He stepped closer, wiping the glass with his sleeve. Footprints. Small. Too small for adults. 2 sets, side by side, leading straight from the edge of the woods toward the frozen lake. But something about them made his gut tighten. There were no prints coming back. He grabbed his coat from the hook and stepped into the cold without a second thought. The door slammed shut behind him with a thud swallowed by snow. The footprints were crisp, recent. He followed them with long strides, eyes squinting against the wind. They led straight on to the lake. Still early in the season, too early for a full freeze. Malcolm's heart began to pound, slow and deliberate, as if his body remembered something he had trained it to forget. The moment before he stopped where the tracks ended, no scuff marks, no return trail. Just a long, frozen silence. Then, faintly, he heard it. A muffled sound, high-pitched, desperate. He dropped to his knees, ear pressed against the ice. It came again, a child's cry, distorted by water and panic. He didn't hesitate. He swung his elbow into the ice once, twice, again. The surface cracked, spidering out like lightning. On the 4th strike, it shattered beneath him with a roar. The cold swallowed him instantly, a ferocious bite that stole his breath and crushed his chest. But he didn't panic. He'd trained for this once. Before the quiet. Before the grief. Beneath the fractured surface, 2 small faces looked back at him, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in screams that didn't rise above the water. One hand slapped the ice, small, frantic. He reached. His fingers searched blindly through the freezing dark until they closed around a wrist, then another. He pulled, teeth clenched, lungs burning, until their bodies broke the surface and he could drag them onto the shattered ledge. He pushed them toward the shore, then climbed out himself, soaked and shaking. The wind hit him like a slap. But they were breathing, both girls, shivering, clinging to each other like ivy around a tree. He scooped them into his arms and began the long walk back, every step slower than the one before, his boots breaking through the top layer of snow. The warmth of the fire had never felt farther away. He didn't speak. Neither did they. Not at first. By the time the cabin came into view, Malcolm's fingers had gone numb, his body trembling violently. He got the door open, kicked it shut behind him, and knelt by the fire. He peeled off their wet coats, wrapped them in blankets, set a kettle on to boil. Then he sat beside them, not too close, just near enough for them to know they weren't alone. The older one, barely more than 6, looked at him with glassy eyes. She didn't speak, just stared. Her lips were blue. Her sister clung to her side. Malcolm fed the fire more logs. The room glowed orange. The kettle began to sing. Outside, the snow still fell. Inside, the world had narrowed to this: 3 survivors, breathing, blinking, warming, beside a flame that refused to die. Malcolm kept the fire stoked through the early hours, barely blinking, his soaked clothes steaming in the heat as they dried on his frame. He didn't ask questions, not yet. The girls were too cold to speak, their bodies locked in shivers, their eyes glassy from fear and frost. He wrapped them in layers, blankets, his old wool coat, even the faded Afghan Selina had once knitted before the world had turned sharp and brittle. The older girl, the one who'd stared at him first, finally spoke near dawn. Just one word. "Clara." Her voice cracked like ice breaking under weight. Malcolm nodded. "I'm Malcolm," he said gently, kneeling to pour hot water into 2 chipped mugs and stirring in a spoonful of honey he'd rationed for emergencies. "And your sister?" Clara looked down at the smaller girl curled against her. "Ivy." Her hand rested protectively on the girl's back. Ivy didn't lift her head. She just whimpered softly, her fingers twisted in the hem of Clara's shirt. He handed the mugs over slowly, letting them feel the warmth against their palms before urging them to drink. They did in tiny sips, eyes never leaving him. Trust didn't come easy in storms like this, he knew. But warmth, quiet, and a steady presence, those were languages even fear understood. As the girls slowly thawed, their skin flushed from pale to pink, their limbs loosened from the tight clutch of cold. They were alive, still silent, but alive. That was enough for now. Outside, the storm had quieted, snow falling in softer swirls, no longer lashing the windows like it had through the night. Malcolm stood by the window, hands on the frame, watching the horizon soften into gray. Something gnawed at the back of his mind, a thread pulling tighter with each breath. 2 children, alone, in the middle of a storm, no coats thick enough for travel, no gear, no adult in sight. Something wasn't right. He turned back, crouched beside the couch, voice low. "Where were you before the lake?" Clara hesitated, chewing her bottom lip, then whispered, "The big house. It was fancy, with glass stairs." Malcolm blinked. There weren't any homes like that in Everpine, not permanent ones at least. He remembered the resort that opened a few years back, an ultra-provident winter retreat nestled deep in the woods for people whose money didn't freeze. "Were you there with your mom and dad?" he asked carefully. Ivy stirred for the first time and murmured, "Just Mommy." Clara nodded, her face suddenly older than it had any right to be. "She said to wait in the room, but we got bored. The snow looked fun." She glanced down, voice small. "We wanted to skate. She always said to try new things." Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. "Did your mom know you left?" Clara shook her head. "She was talking on the phone. She gets really quiet when she's scared. We snuck out. There was a path, it led to the lake." Ivy added, her voice barely audible. "The ice broke." Malcolm exhaled, slow and steady. He stood, moving to the shelf above the fireplace, pulling down the old transistor radio he kept for emergencies. He flicked it on, tuning through static until a voice came through, fragmented but clear enough. "Charlotte Beaumont. Daughters missing. Last seen. Aspen Ridge Resort. Rescue efforts suspended overnight due to storm." He stared at the radio, the name echoing in his chest like a bell. Beaumont. He'd heard it before. A tech magnate, billionaire, owner of a security software empire. He'd seen her once on a news segment, standing in front of a gleaming tower in New York, sunglasses too dark to see through. Charlotte Beaumont didn't vacation in places like Everpine. And yet here her children were, thawing out in his living room, their lives balanced by inches of ice and one man's choice to act. He turned the radio off and looked back at them. Clara was petting Ivy's hair, humming something off-key and familiar. She looked up at him with a flicker of hope. "Will Mommy be mad?" Malcolm shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "She'll just be real glad you're okay." He didn't add the rest. That she was probably out of her mind. That she'd likely moved heaven and earth trying to find them. That when a parent loses track of a child, even for a breath, the world fractures. By mid-morning, the roads had softened enough for him to trust the truck. Malcolm bundled the girls in every warm layer he could find, 2 of Selena's scarves, Sasha's old mittens, his thickest flannel. He packed a thermos of soup and an extra blanket into the back seat of his battered pickup. Ivy clung to his hand as he lifted her into the truck, and Clara settled beside her with a small, brave nod. They drove in silence, the tires crunching through fresh snow, past frozen trees that shimmered like silver ghosts. The entrance to the resort appeared like something from another world. Tall iron gates, camera poles disguised as pine trunks, a long private drive now partially buried. Security swarmed as he pulled in, weapons lowered as soon as they saw the girls through the window. But it was the woman running barefoot through the snow that stole Malcolm's breath. Charlotte Beaumont looked nothing like she did on television. Her designer coat flapped open, hair tangled, face raw with exhaustion. When she saw her daughters, she collapsed to her knees in the snow with a sound Malcolm would never forget. A noise made of disbelief and relief and grief all at once. The girls screamed, "Mommy!" and tumbled out of the truck into her arms. She sobbed into their hair, clutching them like the storm might still take them. Only after the chaos settled, after the medics checked pulses and someone threw a blanket around Charlotte's shoulders, did she stand and walk toward Malcolm. Her lips trembled. Her eyes, red-rimmed and wild, searched his face. "You—" her voice cracked. "You brought them back." Malcolm said nothing, just tipped his hat slightly, fingers still shaking in his gloves. He didn't need thanks, not really. But Charlotte stepped closer, her voice steadier now. "I've had every man on this mountain looking for them, helicopters, dogs, drones. You were alone." She blinked against the wind. "How did you find them?" He met her gaze evenly. "I didn't. I just saw where someone went and didn't come back. Sometimes that's enough." She nodded slowly, a tear streaking down her cheek. "You saved them." Her voice was small now, honest. "You saved my world." He didn't know what to say to that. So he said nothing at all. And then he turned, climbed back into his truck and drove away through the snow, back to his cabin, his fire, and the picture still waiting on the sill. The snow had eased by the time Malcolm reached the cabin again, though the wind still whispered through the eaves like it remembered the storm too well. He stepped out of the truck and into the hush of the woods, the door creaking closed behind him. Inside, the fire had gone low, a bed of glowing embers casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. He knelt, added 2 logs, stirred it to life. The house warmed again. Still, the silence felt different now, emptier somehow, like something important had left and wouldn't be coming back. He sat for a long time in the same chair where Clara had curled up, his eyes on the couch where Ivy had finally fallen asleep, her tiny fingers wrapped around the edge of Selena's old blanket like a child clinging to a raft. He didn't move, didn't make tea, he didn't read, just sat with the ache that had surprised him. He hadn't expected to feel anything at all. But those girls had stirred something in him, something old and half-buried, something that remembered bedtime stories and laughter in small rooms. Tiny boots by the fire and the smell of oatmeal and cinnamon on quiet winter mornings. He thought of the woman, Charlotte, how she'd dropped to her knees in the snow as if the earth itself had given her back what it once threatened to take. The look in her eyes when she saw her children, pure, staggering relief, layered over hours of panic and regret. It wasn't the kind of gratitude you could fake. It was the kind that rewrote your bones. He hadn't known who she was until the radio said it, but the name, Beaumont, meant little to him in the way money did. He didn't follow the stock market, didn't own a phone. The only screen in the house was a 10-inch black and white set that hadn't worked right since 2017. All he knew was what he'd seen. A mother willing to run barefoot into a snowstorm if it meant even a whisper of hope, and he knew, somehow, what that kind of desperation felt like. When the snow had taken his girls, he dug barehanded until they pulled him away, until they told him it was over. But it hadn't been. Not really. The next morning arrived, wrapped in the stillness of fresh snow. He had just stepped outside to split firewood when he heard the tires, not the gravel-churning rumble of a pickup, but the smooth hush of rubber on packed snow. He turned toward the tree line and saw it. An SUV, black, polished, too clean for these roads. It parked just outside the gate, and from it stepped Charlotte Beaumont. No entourage, just a heavy coat and a scarf knotted high on her neck. She walked with slow steps, cautious, like approaching a creature she wasn't sure wouldn't bolt. Malcolm leaned on the axe handle and waited. She stopped a few feet from the porch. Her breath came out in short clouds, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "I didn't know if I'd find the right cabin," she said softly, but Clara remembered the number on the mailbox. He nodded once, arms crossed over his chest. "They're all right?" he asked. She smiled then, small and full of something tender. "They're perfect. No frostbite, no damage. They woke up asking for more soup." She hesitated. "You saved their lives." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. She followed, brushing snow off her sleeves, her gaze moving over the details of the home. Chipped railing, patched window frames, a small rocking chair that had long ago lost one of its runners. She took it all in without judgment. When he opened the door, the warm air wrapped around them like a blanket. She paused in the doorway. "It's quiet here." "It is," he said. She stepped in, her boots squeaking faintly on the floorboards. Her eyes settled on the fireplace, the 2 empty mugs still sitting on the side table, the folded blanket with a strand of Ivy's hair still caught in it. Something shifted in her shoulders then, a breath she'd been holding since the day before. "I came to say thank you," she said, "but I also came to ask you something." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, waiting. Charlotte reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. She didn't hand it to him, not yet. "I've had people on this mountain all night, helicopters grounded, drones frozen, search dogs overwhelmed. All that technology, all that money, and it was you, one man with nothing but a coat and instinct, who brought them home." She looked at him. Really looked. "Why?" He shrugged. "Didn't seem like the kind of thing you wait on. Someone was in trouble. You act." She smiled faintly. "Most people wouldn't. Not anymore. I'm not most people." "I can see that," she said. Then she held out the envelope. "This is something I wanted to give you, a gift, a gesture. I don't know how else to say thank you." And he didn't take it. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said, "You don't owe me anything." Charlotte blinked, her mouth parting slightly. Then slowly she lowered the envelope. "Then maybe," she said carefully, "maybe it's not about owing. Maybe it's about honoring." She stepped back a little, but her voice stayed steady. "I want to do something for you, for this town. You gave me my family. I want to give back something that lasts." Malcolm studied her. She wasn't performing. There was no press, no cameras, no flashing lights, just a woman still unraveling from the terror of almost losing everything, trying to offer something back in return. "Whatever you want to do," he said finally, "do it for them, the girls, not for me." Charlotte nodded, tears glinting in the corners of her eyes. "Then let's call it that, for the girls." And for a long moment they stood in the warmth of that quiet room. 2 people who had lost and nearly lost, who had nothing in common but grief, and now, perhaps, something more. A thread of connection. A story they would carry together, not for credit, not for praise, just because sometimes, when the storm comes, kindness is the only thing strong enough to survive it. The snow hadn't stopped, but it had softened, no longer the kind that battered rooftops and bent pine branches to the ground, but the kind that drifted gently, like it had finally remembered how to be quiet. Malcolm moved through his days as he always had, tending the stove, chopping firewood, checking the water line before it could freeze over. But even as he kept his hands busy, something inside him had shifted. The silence he'd once worn like armor now felt thinner, touched by echoes, laughter by the hearth, the small weight of Ivy asleep on his lap, Clara's cautious but bright eyes watching the snow fall through his window. The cabin hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like a place just meant for solitude. It felt like a place that had mattered. Then came the engines. Not the sputter of a snowmobile or the grind of a neighbor's truck, but something smoother, well-oiled, deliberate, unfamiliar. Malcolm stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes narrowing as a convoy of white utility trucks emerged from the bend in the snow-packed road, crawling toward his cabin like a procession with a purpose. The first truck stopped just short of the gate, and a man stepped out, dressed in heavy winter gear, a clipboard tucked under one arm, and a broad smile spread across a wind-reddened face. "Mr. Davis," the man called. "Brent Carver, Beaumont Properties. Ms. Beaumont sent us." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, arms crossing loosely over his chest. "Sent you for what?" Brent grinned wider, pulling a rolled-up blueprint from inside his coat and giving it a light tap. "Well, she said you might ask that. Also said not to leave until we got started. Said something about quiet people doing loud things when no one's looking." Within the hour, workers fanned out across the property like they'd always known their way around it. The old front steps came down, new insulation went up, windows were measured, then replaced with double-paned glass that didn't rattle in the wind. They worked fast, efficient but respectful, like they understood this wasn't just some project, but something sacred, something earned. By sundown, the front steps had been rebuilt, the drafty windows replaced, a new stovepipe gleamed against the night sky. But it was the wooden plaque mounted quietly near the door that stopped Malcolm cold. It was simple, just his name, carved into the grain with care, and a line below it that read, "This home stands because one man saw footprints and chose to follow." He stared at it for a long time, the snow falling soft against his shoulders, something in his chest tugging loose. He didn't ask who wrote it. He didn't need to. The next morning, a letter arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by hand. The return address was stamped with the Beaumont Foundation crest. Inside was a single page, handwritten, elegant, and spare. "Malcolm, you told me not to owe you anything, so I won't insult you by pretending this is payment. This is legacy, in honor of the courage you showed, when no one was watching, when no one asked. I've launched a winter safety initiative across the entire Everpine region. The first 5 safe stations will be built around the lake. Emergency beacons, heated shelters, warning systems, all under your name. Not for press, not for glory, just because it's right. Thank you for reminding me what that means. Charlotte." He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it between the pages of Selina's old Bible on the mantel. 2 weeks later, the safe stations appeared like quiet monuments. Sturdy red posts with solar lights and insulated storage packed with supplies, blankets, hand warmers, emergency flares. One had a wooden bench beside it facing the lake. A plaque on that bench bore no name, just 4 words. Someone saw, someone came. Locals began to notice. A neighbor from the North Ridge dropped off fresh honeycomb. A boy from town left a bundle of pine kindling on the porch with a note that simply read, "Thanks for the girls." Even the sheriff stopped by, awkward and earnest, holding out a tin of coffee and muttering something about how heroes usually don't wear badges. Malcolm took it all in with the quiet grace of a man who had never asked to be seen, but didn't mind it now. One afternoon he found a box on his steps. No card. Inside were 2 drawings. Crayon and colored pencil, edges smudged from little fingers. One was a picture of the cabin with snowflakes falling and a fire in the window. The other showed him in his flannel shirt, holding the hands of 2 stick-figure girls. Their names were written in messy block letters above their heads, Clara and Ivy, and beneath his, "Our Snow Hero." He smiled then, really smiled, for the first time in what felt like years. He pinned the drawings above the mantel, right beside the old family photo. And somehow, it didn't feel out of place. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and the kettle whistled, Malcolm stood by the window. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, frozen again, but no longer threatening. Around it, soft lights glowed where the new station stood, silent guardians watching over the winter. He raised his cup toward the dark, toward whatever force had guided two little girls across a dangerous lake and into his path. He didn't believe in fate, not really, but he believed in choice. And he had chosen to follow the footprints. Now the world was different because of it. Warmer. Safer. A little less alone. Winter faded slowly, but its impact remained. The snow melted in quiet ribbons down the hillsides, revealing a different everpine than the one that had braced through the storm. At the lake, where it had all begun, a bench now stood beneath the tall pines. Sturdy, simple, carved with the words, "For those who walk toward the cries others ignore." On the day of the dedication, the townspeople gathered. No cameras, no reporters, just locals, neighbors, and the people who had quietly helped rebuild what was almost lost. Clara and Ivy sat front row beside Malcolm, their legs swinging over the edge of the platform. Charlotte stood before them all, steady, composed, holding nothing but a folded sheet of paper in her hand. "When my daughters disappeared into the snow," she began, her voice carrying with quiet strength, "I thought I had lost everything. All the money, the search teams, the technology, none of it reached them in time. But one man did." She looked to Malcolm, who sat still, eyes lowered, hands clasped, and didn't know who they were. He didn't know me. But he saw footprints, and instead of looking away, he followed them. He gave them warmth, safety, food, and never once asked for anything in return. What Amos Carter did wasn't just brave. It was the kind of courage that builds futures. She paused. Around the crowd, heads bowed, a few eyes glistened. "We've built shelters now, safety stations. We've started a winter initiative in his name. But this bench, this moment, is about more than structures. It's about one choice, one man, one life-saving act that reminded all of us what it means to be human." She turned back toward Malcolm. "You didn't ask for thanks, but we're giving it anyway." The crowd stood, quietly, respectfully. Clara slipped her hand into Malcolm's. He didn't say anything. Just nodded once, deep, solemn, grateful. And from that day forward, whenever someone sat at that bench by the lake, they didn't talk about storms or loss. They talked about the man who walked out into the cold and carried two little girls back into the light. Not for recognition, not for reward. Just because it was right. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.